In the desolate depths of Iron Hollow, hidden within Kentucky's Cumberland Plateau, three brothers made a choice so vile it would haunt generations. In 1895, Jedediah, Obadiah, and Malachi Shepherd forged the forbidden pact, sacred unions with their own sister, mother, and aunt. For 25 years, the family's monstrous secret festered in isolation, the snow sealing their sins from the world. But when 16-year-old Elspeth escaped in 1918, her broken words drew Sheriff Silas Blackwood into a nightmare. What creed could twist faith into depravity? What horrors lay buried behind their homestead, and what still lingers in Iron Hollow's cursed soil? Subscribe to stand with us as we document the stories, history buried in silence, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and your local time. The mountains of eastern Kentucky in the year 1895 were a world unto themselves, a landscape so rugged and unforgiving that entire families could vanish into its folds and remain hidden for generations. The Cumberland Plateau rose in successive waves of limestone ridges, each valley more remote than the last, each hollow deeper and darker than the one before it. Here, in a time when the Industrial Revolution was transforming distant cities, life moved according to rhythms unchanged, since the first settlers had pushed into these hills a century earlier. Families cleared small patches of forest, built rough cabins from chestnut and oak, and survived on what they could grow, hunt, or trade at distant settlements reached only after days of arduous travel. In winter, when snow drifted 6 feet deep between the ridges, isolation became absolute. A person could live and die in these mountains without the outside world ever knowing their name. Iron Hollow was among the most remote of these valleys, a place spoken of in hushed tones even by those who lived in neighboring hollows. The valley itself was a geological anomaly, accessible only through a single narrow gap between two towering limestone cliffs that seemed to guard its entrance like sentinels. Once inside, the hollow opened into a bowl, perhaps 2 miles across, ringed entirely by sheer rock faces that rose 300 feet on all sides. A cold stream ran through its center, fed by springs that never froze even in the hardest winters. The trees grew so dense here that sunlight reached the valley floor only at midday, and even then in scattered patches. Local hunters avoided the place, claiming the deer that wandered in never found their way back out. The few who had ventured to its depths spoke of an oppressive silence, as if the hollow itself absorbed sound. It was in this natural fortress, in this place where geography itself enforced secrecy, that the Shepherd family had established their homestead sometime in the 1870s. The patriarch who first claimed this land was a man named Ezekiel Shepherd, a defrocked preacher who had fled civilization with his family after being expelled from his congregation for teachings deemed heretical even by the loose standards of frontier religion. Ezekiel preached that the world beyond the mountains was damned, corrupted beyond redemption by commerce and progress and the mingling of bloodlines. He believed his own family represented a pure strain, a chosen seed that must be protected at all costs from contamination by outsiders. In the isolation of Iron Hollow, with no authority to challenge him and no neighbors to witness his practices, Ezekiel's teachings took root and grew more twisted with each passing year. By the time of his death in 1894, he had established an inflexible doctrine that would govern his descendants long after he was buried in the rocky soil of the hollow. His son Josiah continued the tradition, marrying his own cousin and raising his children according to his father's rigid creed. When Josiah's wife bore him triplet sons in 1878, Jedediah, Obadiah, and Malachi, the old man proclaimed it a sign from God that their bloodline was indeed blessed and must be preserved without dilution. The triplets grew to manhood knowing nothing of the world beyond the cliffs that surrounded their home. They had never seen a town, never attended school, never spoken to anyone outside their immediate family. Their education consisted entirely of their grandfather's teachings and the brutal lessons of survival in an unforgiving wilderness. By the time they reached their 20s, they were physically imposing men, silent and watchful, shaped entirely by the narrow confines of their world. When their grandfather died and their father followed him to the grave just 2 years later, the brothers inherited not just the land, but the sacred duty Ezekiel had instilled in them. The outside world was poison, their bloodline was holy, and the preservation of that bloodline, by whatever means necessary, was their divine obligation. The autumn morning in 1918, when Sheriff Silas Blackwood first laid eyes on Elspeth Shepherd, he knew immediately that something was profoundly wrong. The girl had been found by a hunter named Thomas Pritchard, who had discovered her hiding in a thicket of laurel bushes some 15 miles from the nearest settlement, shivering despite the mild weather, and so emaciated that her collarbones jutted sharply beneath her threadbare dress. Pritchard had brought her directly to the sheriff's office in the small county seat, a town of perhaps 800 souls that served as the nominal center of law and order for thousands of square miles of mountain wilderness. Blackwood was a veteran lawman in his late 50s, a former soldier who had seen terrible things in Cuba during the Spanish-American War and had believed himself beyond shock. But the sight of this 16-year-old girl, with her sunken eyes and the way she flinched at every sudden movement, stirred something in him that transcended professional duty. Elspeth could barely speak at first. She sat in the wooden chair across from Blackwood's desk, her hands trembling in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor as if meeting his eyes might somehow doom her. When she finally began to talk, her words came in fragments, a confused tangle of relationships and events that made no immediate sense. She spoke of brother fathers and sister mothers, of babies that went to sleep in the dirt and never woke up, of 3 men who were one and the same. Blackwood listened with the patience he had learned in decades of dealing with traumatized witnesses, taking careful notes, but not interrupting. He had dealt with plenty of mountain families whose isolation had bred unusual customs, but there was something in Elspeth's halting testimony that suggested horrors beyond mere eccentricity. She spoke of Iron Hollow as if it were a place outside the normal world, a valley where different laws applied and where escape was something she had attempted 3 times before finally succeeding. Blackwood sent for Dr. Alastair Finch, the county's only formally trained physician, a serious man in his early 60s who brought to the mountains a rational scientific perspective often at odds with local superstition. Dr. Finch's examination of Elspeth took place in the small infirmary room behind his office, while Blackwood waited in the hallway, smoking his pipe and considering the implications of what he had heard. When the doctor emerged nearly an hour later, his expression was grave. The girl showed signs of severe and prolonged malnutrition, he reported, as well as evidence of physical abuse consistent with years of harsh treatment. Her teeth were rotting from lack of proper food. Her spine showed signs of developmental damage likely caused by carrying heavy loads during her formative years. She had clearly lived a life of extraordinary hardship and her account, however confused, deserved to be taken seriously. But taking it seriously meant venturing into territory that made even Blackwood uncomfortable. The Shepherd family of Iron Hollow was known to him only as a local legend, one of those strange mountain clans that kept entirely to themselves and were spoken of in the same breath as ghost stories and old wives' tales. The few who claimed to have seen the Shepherds described them as silent, imposing figures who appeared perhaps once a year at a distant trading post to barter furs and ginseng for salt and ammunition. They never stayed long, and they never spoke more than absolutely necessary. Most locals believed it was best to leave such families alone, that the mountains had always harbored people who lived by their own rules, and that interference only led to bloodshed. Blackwood himself had generally subscribed to this philosophy, but Elspeth's testimony and Dr. Finch's medical findings left him with no choice. If even half of what the girl described was true, then something unspeakable was happening in that hollow, and it was his duty to investigate. The problem was that he had almost nothing to go on beyond the word of a traumatized teenager whose story sounded like something from a fever dream. No one in the county had ever set foot on the Shepherd property. No one knew how many people lived there or what conditions might exist behind the natural walls of Iron Hollow. When Blackwood asked around town for men willing to accompany him on an investigative expedition, he found few volunteers. The mountains were dangerous, the Shepherds were said to be heavily armed, and most importantly, there was a deeply ingrained cultural reluctance to interfere in family matters, no matter how strange those matters might be. In the end, Blackwood managed to assemble a reluctant posse of 3 deputies, young men who trusted the sheriff's judgment more than they feared mountain superstition. In early October of 1918, as the leaves began to turn gold and red across the ridges, they set out for Iron Hollow with Elspeth's fragmented directions as their only guide. The journey to Iron Hollow took an entire day of hard travel through terrain that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Blackwood and his 3 deputies followed old game trails that wound between ridges thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron, crossing and recrossing the same cold stream that would eventually lead them to the valley. The forest grew denser as they climbed, the canopy overhead blocking out all but scattered fragments of sunlight. By late afternoon they reached the narrow gap between limestone cliffs that Elspeth had described, a natural gateway barely wide enough for 2 men to pass through side by side. The deputies grew quiet as they entered, their hands moving instinctively to check their sidearms. Beyond the gap, the hollow opened before them like a hidden world, its bowl-shaped valley shrouded in shadows, even though sunset was still an hour away. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their own footsteps and the distant cry of a crow somewhere in the trees. The Shepherd homestead sat at the far end of the valley, a collection of rough structures built from logs chinked with mud and moss. The main cabin was larger than Blackwood had expected, a 2-story affair with a stone chimney from which no smoke rose despite the autumn chill. Smaller outbuildings clustered nearby, their purposes unclear from a distance. As the lawmen approached, 3 men emerged from the cabin and stood waiting on the porch, silent and identical in their weathered clothing and dark beards. The Shepherd triplets were in their early 40s, tall and powerfully built, their faces showing the same flat, watchful expression. Behind them in the doorway appeared an older woman, her gray hair pulled back severely, her eyes hard as flint. Matilda Shepherd regarded the intruders with no visible emotion, as if the arrival of the law was neither surprising nor particularly concerning. Blackwood identified himself and stated his purpose clearly. He had received a report of possible wrongdoing and was here to investigate the welfare of the family's members. The brothers said nothing. It was Matilda who spoke, her voice rough from disuse but perfectly intelligible. They had no need of the law here, she said. They lived according to God's commandments as handed down by their patriarch. The girl who had run away was touched in the head, given to lies and disobedience. She had shamed her family, and they were better off without her. The brothers nodded in unison at their mother's words, a gesture so synchronized it seemed rehearsed. When Blackwood pressed to see the other members of the household, Matilda's expression hardened. There were no others, she claimed, just herself and her sons, living as they always had, bothering no one and asking nothing of the world. But Blackwood had not survived 2 decades as a lawman by accepting obvious lies. He insisted on searching the property, invoking his legal authority under Kentucky law to investigate allegations of criminal activity. The tension on the porch became palpable. The 3 brothers shifted their weight simultaneously, their hands moving to their belts where Blackwood could see the handles of hunting knives. For a long moment, the situation balanced on the edge of violence. Then Matilda spoke again, her tone heavy with contempt. She would allow the search, she said, because they had nothing to hide, and because she knew the law would find nothing to justify their intrusion. She stepped aside and gestured for them to enter, her eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. The interior of the main cabin was dim and sparse, lit only by what little daylight penetrated the small windows. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Blackwood couldn't immediately identify. The main room contained a rough table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace. A ladder led to a loft above. The deputies searched methodically, their boots echoing on the worn floorboards, but found nothing obviously incriminating. No weapons beyond what any mountain family might own, no signs of struggle or imprisonment. Yet Blackwood's instincts screamed that something was wrong. The cabin was too clean in places and too neglected in others. One section of the floor near the back wall had been scrubbed so thoroughly that the wood was nearly white, while dust lay thick everywhere else. And there were the children, 3 small faces that appeared briefly at the edge of the loft before being pulled back by unseen hands. Their eyes had been wide and fearful, the look of creatures accustomed to hiding. The search of the outbuildings yielded similarly frustrating results. A smokehouse, empty except for a few dried haunches of venison. A small barn housing a pair of mules and some chickens. A root cellar dug into the hillside, stocked with jarred vegetables and sacks of cornmeal. Everything one would expect from a self-sufficient mountain family, and nothing that would justify removing anyone from their home. As the afternoon light began to fail and the shadows in the hollow grew longer, Blackwood faced the bitter reality that he had no legal grounds to act. Without physical evidence or additional witnesses, the word of a confused teenage girl would not stand against a family's right to live as they chose on their own land. He gathered his deputies and prepared to leave, watched by the silent triplets and their stone-faced mother. But as they turned toward the trail that would lead them back out of the valley, one of the deputies, a young man named Henry Cobb, noticed something the others had missed. Behind the main cabin, nearly hidden by overgrowth, was the faint trace of a path leading into the dense forest. Deputy Henry Cobb was the youngest of Blackwood's men, barely 23 years old, and possessed of the sharp eyesight that comes with youth. He had been studying the tree line behind the cabin, troubled by something he couldn't quite articulate, when he noticed the path. It was barely visible, more an absence of undergrowth than a deliberate trail, but it led deliberately away from the main homestead into a particularly dense thicket of mountain laurel. Blackwood ordered the shepherds to remain where they were and followed the path with his deputies, their hands now openly resting on their revolvers. The brothers moved as if to follow, but Matilda placed a restraining hand on Jedediah's arm and spoke a single word that stopped all three in their tracks. The lawmen pushed through the laurel, branches catching at their clothes, until the forest opened into a small clearing, perhaps 50 yards from the main cabin. What they found there would haunt Blackwood for the rest of his life. A second cabin stood in the clearing, smaller than the first, and in terrible disrepair. Its roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and several of the logs in its walls had rotted through, leaving gaps that let in wind and rain. But it was clearly inhabited. Smoke rose from a crude stone chimney, and through the gaps in the walls, Blackwood could see movement inside. He called out, identifying himself as the Law, and after a long silence, he heard a woman's voice, thin and uncertain, asking if they were truly from outside the hollow. When Blackwood confirmed that they were, the door opened slowly to reveal a sight that defied comprehension. Two women stood in the doorway, both malnourished to the point of emaciation, their clothing little more than rags. The older of the two, a woman Blackwood would later identify as Patient Shepherd, was perhaps in her late 50s, her hair completely white and her face marked by a lifetime of hardship. The younger woman, Eliza, appeared to be in her late 30s but looked far older, her eyes holding the vacant expression of someone whose spirit had been broken long ago. Behind them, in the dimness of the cabin's interior, Blackwood could see children, at least 6 of them, ranging in age from infants to young teenagers. Several showed obvious signs of severe developmental problems, their features marked by the telltale deformities that come from generations of inbreeding. The smell that wafted from the cabin was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, sickness, and despair. Patience was the first to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush, as if she feared she would not be allowed to finish. She and Eliza had been kept here for years, she said, confined to this rotting structure and forbidden from approaching the main cabin except when summoned. They were the wives of Obadiah and Jedediah, respectively, married to their own nephews in ceremonies conducted by Matilda according to the family's sacred law. The third brother, Malachi, had taken his own mother as his wife, and she remained in the main cabin as the family's matriarch and enforcer of their twisted doctrine. The children were the products of these unions, and many more had been born only to die within days or weeks, their bodies buried somewhere on the property. Elspeth, Patience explained with tears streaming down her weathered face, was Eliza's daughter, born from her union with her brother. The girl had been scheduled to be given to one of the brothers as well, continuing the cycle, but she had found the courage to run. Blackwood felt a cold fury building in his chest as he listened, a rage tempered by his years of experience into something focused and purposeful. He ordered his deputies to bring the women and children out of the cabin immediately and to prepare them for transport back to town. Then he asked Patience a question that had been forming since Elspeth first mentioned babies going to sleep in the dirt. Where were the graves? Patience hesitated, glancing back toward the main cabin, as if even now she feared retribution. Then she pointed to an area behind the dilapidated structure, a patch of ground that looked like it might once have been a small garden. Blackwood walked to the spot and knelt, examining the earth carefully. The soil was disturbed in several places, forming small mounds barely visible beneath the encroaching weeds. He began to dig with his bare hands, and within minutes he had uncovered the tiny bones of an infant, wrapped in rotting cloth and buried less than 2 feet below the surface. By the time Blackwood and his men returned to the main cabin with their evidence and witnesses, twilight had fallen over Iron Hollow. The 3 brothers stood exactly where they had been left, motionless as statues, while Matilda waited on the porch with her arms crossed over her chest. Blackwood announced that they were all under arrest for incest, unlawful confinement, and contributing to the deaths of children. He expected resistance, perhaps even violence, but instead the shepherd simply stared at him with expressions of cold contempt. Matilda spoke once more, her voice carrying clearly across the darkening yard. They had committed no crime, she said. They had obeyed the laws of their patriarch, laws that superseded any earthly authority. They had kept their bloodline pure as God commanded, and if the world could not understand that, then the world was damned. The brothers nodded in unison, and for the first time since Blackwood had arrived, they spoke, their voices so similar as to be indistinguishable. They had done their sacred duty, they said, and they would answer to no law but their grandfather's. The trial of the Shepherd family began in the spring of 1919 and became a sensation that drew spectators from across the state. The small courthouse in the county seat had never seen such crowds, with people lined up before dawn to secure seats in the gallery. Newspaper reporters arrived from Louisville and Lexington, their lurid accounts of the case spreading the story far beyond the isolated mountains where it had occurred. The prosecution presented a case that was as straightforward as it was horrifying. Dr. Finch testified about the physical evidence of long-term abuse and malnutrition he had documented in the surviving women and children. Sheriff Blackwood methodically described his investigation, presenting photographs of the dilapidated second cabin and the unmarked graves. Elspeth took the stand and told her story in a stronger voice than she had possessed that first day in the sheriff's office, her testimony corroborated in every detail by Patience, and, more reluctantly, by Eliza, whose psychological damage made her a heartbreaking witness. But it was the defense's case that truly revealed the depth of the Shepherd's conviction. Their court-appointed attorney, a man named Walter Grissom, who had drawn the assignment with evident reluctance, attempted to argue diminished capacity due to extreme isolation. The Shepherds, he claimed, had been raised in conditions so removed from civilized society that they genuinely did not understand their actions to be criminal. It was a reasonable strategy given the circumstances, but the Shepherds themselves undermined it at every turn. They refused to show remorse or even acknowledge that their actions were wrong. When Jedediah took the stand, he spoke with a chilling certainty about the purity of their bloodline and the sacred duty they had fulfilled. His grandfather had received divine instruction, he testified, to preserve their family untainted by the corrupted world. They had obeyed that instruction faithfully, as any righteous man would obey God's commandments. The children born with defects, he said without emotion, were tests of their faith, and the deaths were God's will. Matilda's testimony was even more disturbing. She showed no hint of maternal feeling when discussing the suffering of her own daughter and sister-in-law. Instead, she spoke of them as vessels for the continuation of the bloodline, necessary participants in a sacred duty. She had enforced her father-in-law's teachings, she said, because she understood that their family was chosen and that the preservation of their purity was more important than any individual's comfort or even survival. When the prosecutor asked her if she felt any regret for the children who had died, she responded that all life and death was in God's hands, and that the weak who perished had simply not been meant to carry the bloodline forward. The courtroom fell silent at her words, the spectators seemingly unable to process such absolute conviction in the face of such obvious cruelty. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. The Shepherd brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment at the state penitentiary in Eddyville, a brutal facility where they would spend their remaining years in adjacent cells, still united in their belief that they had done no wrong. Matilda was sentenced differently. The judge, after hearing testimony from Dr. Finch about her psychological state, determined that she was both a perpetrator and a victim, a woman so warped by her own upbringing and isolation that she could not be held entirely responsible for her actions. She was committed to the Western State Lunatic Asylum in Hopkinsville, where she would spend the next decade before dying of pneumonia, never having renounced the beliefs that had led to such tragedy. The surviving women and children faced uncertain futures. Eliza and Patience were deemed incapable of independent living after their years of captivity and abuse. They were placed in church-run institutions where they received care for the remainder of their lives, though neither ever truly recovered from their ordeal. The children presented an even more complex problem. Those with severe developmental issues required permanent institutional care. The others, including Elspeth, were placed in state guardianship and given educations meant to prepare them for lives outside the only world they had known. Elspeth herself showed remarkable resilience, learning to read and write and eventually finding work as a seamstress in a town far from the mountains. She never married and never returned to Kentucky, living a quiet, solitary life until her death in 1967. In her later years, she gave a single interview to a local historian in which she spoke of her childhood as if describing someone else's life, a nightmare from which she had finally awakened. The Iron Hollow homestead met its own dark end. After the trial, locals avoided the property entirely, regarding it as cursed ground. The cabins fell into further disrepair, and within a few years, someone, their identity never determined, set fire to the structures. The flames consumed both cabins completely, leaving only stone foundations and chimneys standing among the trees. The land itself was never claimed or sold, remaining a forgotten pocket of wilderness within the national forest that was established in the region decades later. Today, hikers occasionally stumble upon the ruins, unaware of the horror that once transpired there. The graves of the infants were never properly marked, their exact number never definitively established, though estimates suggest at least a dozen children died as a result of the Shepherd family's practices. The case of the Iron Hollow Shepherds remains a dark chapter in Appalachian history, a reminder of how geographic isolation and absolute conviction can create worlds with their own terrible moralities. It speaks to the dangers of insularity, of belief systems so rigid they override the most basic human compassion, and of how evil can flourish when hidden from the light of outside scrutiny. Sheriff Silas Blackwood retired 3 years after the trial, haunted by what he had discovered in that hidden valley, but satisfied that he had answered the call of duty when it mattered most. The courage of one teenage girl, desperate and terrified but determined to escape, had been enough to crack open a generational nightmare and bring it finally into the light. In the end, that courage was the one redemptive thread in a story otherwise defined by suffering and darkness, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of unimaginable horror.